This research is titled Improving Behavior of Students Diagnosed with ADHD Through Visual Cue Intervention by Nick Ludwig, credentials, graduate student at Morningside University and teacher at Burlington High School. First slide is the problem statement. ADHD is an issue that a lot of teachers and educators alike face with students. Students who are diagnosed with ADHD are more likely to have a higher dropout rate and failures in the classroom than non-diagnosed peers. Students must be identified as having ADHD by a medical professional. It can't just be an observation claimed by a teacher without actual documentation by a medical professional. So why me? Teachers do not have enough strategies and interventions to help improve the behavior and overall education for students who are diagnosed with ADHD. My plan is to hopefully add toward helping and remedying the fact that there are so little strategies to help deal with students who are diagnosed with ADHD. The literature review searched over a lot of different sources to see exactly what is out there and how people are handling the issues with ADHD. So the first one I looked at here is communication styles, and the first study would be from Wang, Burness, and Eberhard from 2004. They found that students responded best to communication that was not solely verbal, that gestured communication or verbal gestured communication was better for ADHD students. In another study by Nilsson, Mangle, and McDonald in 2013, they studied referential communication, verbal communication with students diagnosed with ADHD and found that ADHD students were more prone to making interpretive errors when given referential verbal cues. And then in a study by Michalczek from 2012 found that young adults diagnosed with ADHD were highly sensitive to visual stimuli, and this sensitivity inhibited their learning ability for audible information. To continue the literature review, I looked at some suggestions on how to deal with students who have ADHD, and the first I found was the optimal stimulation theory. And this theory stated that students need to be engaged in activities and frequently stimulated. The impact from that is that students respond best when optimally stimulated. Too much stimulation or too little stimulation will have adverse results. Potential problems. I looked in a study by Miller, Hanford, Fossbender, Duke, and Schweitzer from 2011, and they found that adults with ADHD had impairments in the area of effect recognition. This is also described as facial expression recognition. So these students would have struggled when getting cues from reading someone's facial expression. And then in another study by Booth, Berman, Meyer, Lee, Tromer, Davenport, and Mesalam from 2005, they studied brain imagery scans of individuals with ADHD, and they found that their frontal lobes did not activate when given a response inhibition task. While the control group in that study, they did have their frontal lobes light up when given the response inhibition task. This shows that individuals who do not have ADHD are thinking more clearly and with a deeper insight and knowledge from that using that frontal lobe, while students with ADHD, they're firing off in other parts of the brain, not necessarily in the frontal lobe. Goals and objectives of the study. The whole purpose of the study is to determine the impact of a visual cue intervention on the overall behavior of students diagnosed with ADHD. The tool that I'm going to use is the visual cues that will be given to the students instead of verbal feedback alone. And to measure this, I'm going to be using an online behavior rubric. The hypothesis that this researcher hypothesized that a visual cue intervention strategy targeted towards students with ADHD would improve that student behavior. The variables of the study, the independent variable being the use of the visual cue intervention strategy, and the dependent is the scores that the students end up receiving on their behavior rubrics. The possible impact. This will hopefully help teachers and students have a more productive classroom environment with less time spent on classroom discipline, more time being able to focus on classroom activities. Furthermore, my work as an educator will be impacted on whether or not I choose to employ this intervention in the classroom beyond just the experiment that I had already conducted for 8 weeks. The methodology, the participants. The students that participated in the study were students from a behavior management classroom, grades 9 through 12. The students have all been diagnosed with ADHD and come from various socioeconomic backgrounds and demographics. So the participants were students that I teach on an everyday basis. It was 2 separate classrooms, one with 5 students, one with 4 students. But again, they all had a behavior goal and all had been diagnosed with ADHD. The materials that we used for, or that I used for the experiment were 5 by 7 inch cutout visual cue cards. They were laminated and made of various colors. So on the cue cards, it would have stated either a positive or a negative response. And which one you ended up giving to the student would be, so for example, one would be like on a red cue card, and it would say, you're doing a great job, keep up the good work, providing them with the feedback when they were on task, and then when they were off task or they were doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing, say they were on their cell phone or on the computer or being distracted by stimulation that wasn't advantageous to the classroom, I would present them with a visual cue card where they would be of a different color. It could be red, could be orange, yellow, purple, green, blue, and then it was laminated and it would say, right now you are off task. Would you please correct this and refocus on what you should be doing? Also, the materials needed would be the behavior rubric. It would be available through internet access, and I had access to it as the teacher, as well as the paraeducator in the classroom. She also had access to the behavior rubric, and then you just would fill that out at the end of every class period. And there's guidelines on specifically when to dock points from the students if they didn't respond to the cues, and if they continued to be off task, you would take more points away. The procedure was 2 50-minute class periods. As I said previously, there was 5 students in one class and 4 students in the other. The layout started with the 2 weeks of establishing the baseline without visual cues, only normal verbal feedback when students were being off task and when students were not getting their work done. Then after that baseline was established, there was 2 weeks of incorporating the visual cue intervention and then recording the data every day on that. Following from there, there was the 2 weeks of the removal of the visual cues, and then 2 weeks after that, there was a reapplication of the visual cue intervention. The plan was to do an A-B experimental design. So the first 2 weeks was the baseline. The second 2 weeks, we're taking the data on how the visual cue, incorporating it, worked, and then 2 weeks removing of it to kind of see how they reacted going back towards the way that we previously were grading them on performance in the classroom, and then reapplicating that visual cue intervention for 2 weeks after the fact, just to see a comparison on how much the intervention worked or didn't work. Data analysis progress was monitored at the end of each class period by the teacher or the paraeducator, and the data was analyzed at the end of the 8-week intervention. The results showed that there was no significant correlation in phase 1 of the visual cue intervention. Phase 1 in this case was the baseline compared to the very first application of the treatment. The p-value was greater than 0.01. Therefore, the correlation could not be determined. With the 8 degrees of freedom and a negative 0.632 number, it was just not enough to show that the data was making any significant gains for the students between the baseline and the first application of the treatment. So then we moved into phase 2, where we had the removal of the treatment and then the reapplication, and we compared those two. So this would be weeks 5 through 8, the last 4 weeks of the data collection. So when the removal of the treatment was compared to the reapplication of the treatment, there was a statistically significant increase in student scores on their behavior rubric in that phase 2 of the visual cue intervention, where there was a negative 3.605 t-score, and the p-value was below 0.01, so we could statistically say that there was a significant increase in the student scores, and it showed that the behavior was linked to the intervention, the visual cue intervention. The implications of this is that the participants in this experiment benefited from the visual cue intervention strategy because their behavior showed improvement. The increased visual feedback between the teacher and the student helped to keep the students engaged. It impacted both the students and the teachers. The research determined a potential way to create a less stressful environment for both the students and the teachers. The students may also benefit academically by modifying this from just being a behavior visual intervention strategy into an academic one as well. The limitations of the study, the first one is the demographics. 55% of the participants were Black and 77% were male. This isn't conductive of the entire student body population at large, or the state population of Iowa, or the United States population. The demographics were far more representative of Black students and male students. The second limitation is the lack of a control group. There was no control group of students without an ADHD diagnosis, so therefore we have no way to know how students who would be in a general education setting without ADHD would respond to this visual cue intervention. It might work for all students, it might just work for ADHD students, but we wouldn't know until we tested that again. And the sample size was only 9 students were used because only ADHD students could be selected, and only students in the high school were used. So there was no students in elementary or a middle school setting. And lastly, the research was limited by the fact that it was only conducted in a special education setting. There was no general education setting available to test on them. Recommendations. So the 4 recommendations to go along with those limitations is we need to have a future study with improved demographics that are more representative of the student body of the state of Iowa or the United States in general. A second study is a future study to incorporate the use of a control group, a comparison group of students who were general education who did not have ADHD. A future study would need to include a bigger sample size of students from different ages, include different age groups from preschool, elementary, middle school, and then lastly, a future study that would include students with ADHD in general education settings, just to know how they respond, not in just a special education setting. And the following are the references that I used some in the presentation, some in the paper.